Hello everyone, my name is Chris Bellotta, and I'm pleased to be able to present a session on managing your career and specifically working with recruiters. The purpose of today's talk is to really compare and contrast the various types of search or recruiting firms and then provide some tips on how to best use recruiting firms in your job search. Just a little bit about myself. I'm a president of Resource Development Company. We're an HR consulting and executive search firm, and I've been doing this for about 20 years now. I'm formerly a CPA, a certified professional resume writer currently, and I have my BS in accounting and MBA from Drexel. If you want to find out more about me, you could go directly to my own personal website, which is www.christopherbellotta.com. So let's talk about the types of firms that you may run into in conducting a job search. There are two main ones, retained search firms and contingency search firms, and they're the ones that we're going to concentrate on in today's talk. A third type of firm is an employment agency, but typically retained and contingency firms, their fees are paid by client companies. In some cases, employment agencies, the individual is paying fees. I would say that in any job search that you may be conducting, you should never pay a fee to an agency to help them find you a job. And so that's why we're going to focus on retained and contingency firms for our purposes today. So let's talk a little bit about a retained search firm and some of the characteristics that make a retained search firm different from a contingency firm. First of all, retained search firms are much more consulting oriented. They work very closely with their client companies, getting to know them, the organization, their culture, as well as the specifics of the job, not only the requirements that are needed immediately, but how that job or position fits into a strategic plan for the company. Retained search firms receive exclusive assignments from client companies, and by that I mean once a company decides to use a retained search firm, they don't use any other recruiting firms or any other methods. Their entire process is focused with the retained search firm. Now, this is a general statement, but typically retained search firms are used to fill senior level positions. And for purposes of today, I would define that as any positions that are over 100K. Retained search firms in conducting searches really focus on the process. And by that I mean going about sourcing candidates, identifying individuals, evaluating them, and then leading them through the client interview process. So from start to finish, a retained firm is really focused primarily on the steps in that process. As I mentioned earlier, being a consulting-oriented firm, they really develop a full understanding of their client's organization as well as the position. And when conducting a search, retained firms are usually doing original research. By that I mean they're going out and sourcing individuals who are primarily working right now. They are ones that are not necessarily actively looking. So in doing a search, retained search firms will typically maintain confidentiality of their client. They don't reveal who their client company is, but they'll describe an opportunity to a prospective candidate in specific enough terms that they can identify with the position, but in general enough terms that they don't know who the client is. And that's for several different reasons. Many times a search involves replacing an incumbent, so confidentiality is very important. But in many cases, they're just not going to reveal who the client is because they're conducting the search, and a client in hiring a retained search firm doesn't want to be inundated with resumes or phone calls. They want the retained firm to handle all candidate in processing. As I mentioned a little bit earlier, retained search firms are typically targeting passive candidates, people who are not out in the active job market, but who may be interested in an opportunity, and if it's the right one, they may be compelled to listen and investigate it further. A retained search firm also never presents a single candidate to more than one client. When they're doing a search, remember we talked about exclusivity, and that is the same on the candidate side as they present candidates to their clients. When they're conducting a search, any clients that they source in that particular effort belong to that client company. Another thing about a retained search firm is that they will conduct very thorough candidate evaluations, from maybe an opening telephone call but to an in-depth face-to-face interview. They may also conduct some of their own profile assessments in helping to evaluate candidates, but they will do a thorough vetting of the individuals that they end up presenting to their client, with the thinking that any of the candidates that they ultimately present to a client company are ones that are more than qualified to do the job in terms of their technical or hard skills. It really comes down to how they fit with a company's culture and the chemistry between the individuals. But they go through an exhaustive evaluation, including reference checks and other background type of work. Something else that a retained search firm will do is provide status reports to their client company, and these could be on a weekly or monthly basis, depending on how long the search is taking. But they'll provide reports in terms of the number of candidates they've talked to, the disposition of each one of those, and that keeps the communication flow between the retained search firm and their client constant. In terms of how a retained search firm is paid, they receive client fees up front or during the course of the search. Much like a lawyer is retained, so a retained search firm is paid initially to launch the search, and then based on several milestones during the search. So a client company is really paying for the process. Of course, the ultimate goal is to find the right person, but the typical retained search fee structure, the entire fee is paid during the course of the search prior to a company hiring an individual. Well, let's talk about some of the characteristics of contingency recruiting firms. First, a contingency firm is much more transaction oriented. They're talking to higher volumes of people, candidates, as well as companies, and their ultimate goal is to get as many people in front of a hiring company as possible to increase the odds that they may hire one of the individuals that they present. As you recall, we talked about exclusivity with a retained search firm. Contingency firms compete with not only the client company, who may be utilizing other sources in their recruiting process, but they also are competing against other contingency firms. Typically, a company will put a job out if they're going to do it with a contingent firm, and they'll use several different firms, as well as probably posting the job themselves, networking, so that a contingency firm really has a lot of competition when they're out trying to fill a position, and hence the timing is critical. They've got to move very quickly, and that's why I say it's much more transaction oriented. Again, not to generalize, but contingency firms are used to fill lower level positions, individual contributor roles. Again, just for purposes of this presentation, drawing the line of demarcation at $100,000 in terms of salary. As we said, where the retained search firm is focused on the process, a contingency firm is focused much more on placement. Being volume driven, transaction oriented, their whole focus is getting people in front of a client company to get the placement. And because of that, a contingency firm really spends a lot less time understanding the company and the position. Typically, they get a job spec from a company, and they're immediately out trying to source people who they feel are going to fit that. But it's really, again, because of timing, they don't put a lot of effort into understanding the company, the culture, a lot of specifics behind the position. What contingency firms will typically do when they launch a search is they'll they'll look in their own internal databases. They'll scan internet resume databases. They'll also post jobs on numerous job boards, as opposed to retained firms that'll focus more on passive candidates. Contingency firms are really looking for people that are actively in the market, seeking jobs, either whether they're working or maybe are unemployed. And that is why you'll see contingent firms much more prevalent on the internet with postings or scanning databases to find people that are currently looking for jobs. Again, we mentioned about a retained firm will only present one candidate to a client company. Contingency firms, since they're not exclusive, neither are their candidates, and they'll present the same candidate to multiple companies if that individual is a fit for that potential job. They'll do cursory screening. Contingent firms, again, because of time and the sense of urgency for them to get people in front of a client, they'll really do just some basic screening, salary, education, whether a relocation is involved, and what the candidate's desire to move is, so that it's very basic. And what they're presenting ultimately to a company is the candidate resume with maybe a very short write-up, but typically just the resume with maybe some notes. As we discussed about a retained firm where the fees are paid up front and along the way, a contingency firm only receives their fee once they've made a placement, and hence the word contingent. It's contingent on the client company hiring one of the individuals that a contingent firm has placed in front of them. So again, you can see that timing is critical, where a contingent firm can't spend the amount of time that a retained firm would on a particular opening. One, because they're competing against a lot of other firms and the client company, and also they can't do the type of research that's necessary to source the passive candidates because of timing. And usually a contingent firm will give an opening a week or two, and if they can present candidates, great. If not, typically they'll move on to another search. So let's look at a comparison of these characteristics between retained and contingency. First, the orientation. As we mentioned, retained firms are much more consulting oriented, while contingency firms are focused on that transaction. The client relationship in a retained firm is exclusive. On a contingent firm, it's non-exclusive. A client company will choose to work with various firms and post jobs themselves. Again, the type of positions, and I stress that this is a general statement, but retained firms are usually involved in searches for higher level senior management positions, while contingent firms will do lower level. Although I can tell you in my own experience, I've done searches across the organization chart for some of my clients, whether it's been for the president or the executive secretary to the president. Companies will use a retained search approach if it makes sense, whether you're looking for someone with very specific skills or maybe scarce skills, where the type of process that a retained search engages in would really add value and be of much more benefit. We talked about the type of service level that a retained firm versus a contingency firm delivers. And a retained firm really customizes their services for the particular client. It's a high touch, high customer service oriented approach, where the contingent firm, again, because of timing and the transaction nature of the relationship, it's a lower service level. The candidate sourcing. Retained firms will focus much more on the passive candidate, although that's not to exclude that they are spreading the net as far as they can to hit as many candidates and really expand the potential universe. There are a lot of good candidates out there who may be looking for jobs, and a retained firm is not going to exclude them, but the focus is primarily on doing original research and sourcing passive candidates, whereas contingent firms much more rely on active candidates who have a resume, who may be out on the internet already, where they can source from different job boards. Fee responsibility in both cases, the client company would pay the fee. And again, I caution anyone out there in a job search, you should never pay a fee to help a firm find you a job. And payment terms for a retained firm, as we discussed, there's upfront fees, and then during the search based on certain milestones, while a contingent firm, they only receive their fee once the person has been placed and started in the job. So what does that mean for you as an individual conducting a job search in working with a recruiter, whether they're with a retained firm or a contingent firm? Let's first talk about how someone works with a retained firm. First of all, it's very important to understand what a retained firm is paid to do. They are not paid to market candidates. They are strictly being paid to find the best candidate out there for a specific need. So timing is very important as well. You may have a great background, but that search firm may not be working on any opportunities at that present time that are a particular fit for you. And you need to understand that they're not going to necessarily market you to any of their clients. So you want to make sure that your expectations about what a retained firm can do for you are realistic. You can make cold calls to retained recruiting firms to introduce yourself and get into their database, but don't expect that they're going to immediately have something for you or want to interview you or meet you face to face. Typically, a retained firm will only invest the time once they have an opening and they see that it might be a match for your background. Send personal correspondence to retained firms when you see that your skills might match an assignment, a current search assignment that they're working on. Highlight the matches, but make it a personal note and really express where you see the fit and your interest in that particular assignment. If you can, the best way to work with a retained firm is to gain an introduction to a specific consultant, whether through networking or in any other way, maybe using LinkedIn, but some way if you can gain an introduction and make it more of a personal connection, that goes a long way. But what you need to understand is that if you don't get any feedback, if you're not hearing from a retained firm, don't take that personally. Again, they're focused on current assignments and what people may fit those. Doesn't mean that 6 months from now they may not have an assignment that matches you exactly and you would hear from them. But again, not getting any type of response, don't take that to mean that there's absolutely no interest or that you may never be considered by a retained firm. Now, working with a contingent firm, I suggest that first you find a firm that specializes in maybe your industry or your discipline, whether you're a finance person, an operations engineering person. There are contingent firms out there that specialize in particular industry niches as well as specific disciplines, and that could be sales or marketing. But if you find a firm that matches up with your desires and your background, that's the place to start. Most importantly, with a contingent firm, you want to develop a personal connection, a comfort level with the specific recruiter, so that that recruiter really understands who you are, they appreciate your background, and most importantly, they know what you're looking for in terms of your next job or opportunity. What you don't want is a recruiter sending you jobs that are not in any way related to what you do or that are of interest to you, or that they are representing you to potential client companies that you have no interest in or that really aren't a fit for what your goals are. So it's important that the recruiter in a contingent firm really have that understanding so that they can represent you in the best way possible. To do that, to find that type of recruiter, it's best to get referrals from other candidates that they've worked with. Really talk to them in depth, how they were treated, what the length of time was that it may have taken for them to find a job, what type of follow-up and feedback did they get. Most importantly, if you are interviewing for a job through a firm, a contingent firm, and you don't get the job, it's good to get the feedback so that you can make corrections or get an understanding of what might have been missing in that particular opportunity that you can present to another one. Most importantly, in working with really any recruiter, keep your appointments, return calls, and be cooperative, and be honest. When you're working with a recruiter, there's got to be a trust factor. Again, getting back to that idea that you want the recruiter to really understand you, you need to have the same respect for the recruiter. So there's nothing to be gained by being vague or dishonest. Let them know exactly what you're looking for when it comes in terms of salary or compensation. All these things are important so that your time and their time won't be wasted. Remember, while follow-up is important, you don't want to overdo it. Believe me, if there's something going on, you will hear from that recruiter. It's okay to check in periodically and to remind them that you're out there, but don't get into a habit of calling every other day or too frequently where it really becomes a burden to the recruiter and kind of a turnoff for them. So we've talked about the differences in the firms. We've talked about how you can work with the respective recruiting firms. How about how do you identify them and find firms that might be a good match for you? On a national level, really one of the best source is the Kennedy Directory, which you can find online or in libraries. And this is really the red book of recruiting. Every search firm, both retained and contingency, can be found in the Kennedy Directory. And they go into specific detail about the types of industries, the positions, the names of the consultants and recruiters in the firm, the size of the firm. Really gives you a great look into a particular firm and help you gauge whether it might be the type of firm that you want to work with. On a local level, one good source is the Philadelphia Business Journal Book of Business Lists. You may have, if you're familiar with the Business Journal, you know that each week they come out with a list, and then they compile those lists at the end of the year into their book of lists. And each year they do list the top 20, both executive search firms and contingent firms in the Philadelphia area, and give you contact information about their disciplines and industries, and also in some cases the salary levels that they work at. So both of these sources are a great place to start to identify firms and narrow them down to a list that you want to work with. But remember, it all comes down to the relationship that you develop with that specific consultant. Let them get to know you, you get to know them, and what you're doing is really developing a business partnership so that you can be an effective job seeker, and if you're using a recruiting firm, that they can assist you in the best way possible.